You stay right here with me. Charles's words hung in the freezing air of the shipping container, long after his eyes finally slid shut. I stood frozen by the narrow military cot, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't naive. I knew what men like him were capable of. But the way he looked at me, like I was something infinitely valuable, something he had already claimed, ignited a strange, reckless heat in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. Marco had stepped out to walk the perimeter, leaving me completely alone with the sleeping boss. The heavy steel door was locked from the outside. There was nowhere to run. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I needed to do something with my hands to stop them from trembling. I slid to the cold metal floor and pulled the cheap plastic pharmacy basket toward me. Julian, the terrified vet, had stuffed it with extra gauze, medical tape, and saline before we fled. I started pulling the supplies out, organizing them in neat rows just to keep my mind busy. I picked up a heavy spool of white surgical tape, intending to cut a few strips just in case Charles tore his stitches in his sleep. As I unspooled the edge, something small and heavy dislodged from the cardboard center. It hit the metal floor with a sharp clack. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a battery. It wasn't a broken piece of medical plastic. It was a matte black magnetic GPS microtransmitter. A tiny red LED light pulsed silently in its center. Julian hadn't just handed me a basket of life-saving supplies, and he had handed me a Trojan horse. A cold, familiar dread washed over me, completely erasing the exhaustion in my bones. A normal, disgraced surgical resident wouldn't know what that device was. A normal doctor would probably think it was a piece of broken equipment. But I wasn't just a surgical doctor. Long before I opened my secret basement clinic, I had spent years surviving in the deep underground, forced at gunpoint to patch up soldiers for various cartels south of the border. I knew how the criminal underworld operated. I knew their tech. That blinking red light meant the transmitter was actively pinging our exact coordinates to a hit squad. "Marco," I whispered, my voice trembling, but Marco was outside. I scrambled across the floor on my hands and knees, grabbing the transmitter. If it had been pinging since we left the vet clinic, Reyes's men weren't just looking for us. They were already pulling into the harbor. I lunged toward Charles's cot. I didn't care that he needed rest. I slammed my hand over his mouth and grabbed his bare shoulder, shaking him hard. His dark eyes snapped open instantly. There was no grogginess, no confusion. Within a fraction of a second, his massive hand shot up, his thick fingers wrapping around my throat in a lethal, instinctual chokehold. He flipped us, pinning me flat against the narrow cot beneath him. His heavy, burning body pressed me deep into the mattress, his chest heaving against mine as he tensed for an attack. "It's me," I choked out, my hands flying up to grip his thick wrists. "Charles, let go," recognition flashed in his dark eyes. Had he instantly released the pressure on my throat? But he didn't move off me. He stayed perfectly still, his heavy frame blanketing mine, trapping me completely. The sheer heat radiating off his skin was intoxicating. His face was only inches from mine, his ragged breath washing over my lips. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice a low, rough rasp that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "Is it the infection?" "No," I breathed. I couldn't look away from his mouth, but I forced my hand up between our chests, opening my palm. Julian set us up. It was hidden inside the surgical tape. It's a cartel-grade micro-tracker. Reyes must have gotten to him. Charles stared down at the device. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. The deadly calm that washed over his face was far more terrifying. "How long has it been out of the clinic?" he asked softly. "A few hours," I answered quickly, my mind slipping right back into the tactical survival mode I thought I had buried years ago. It's a shortwave burst transmitter. Hit squads use them because they don't rely on cell towers. If it's been pinging since dawn, they aren't mapping our route. They are already walking through the shipping yard. Charles looked up from the tracker, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The cold fury in his gaze shifted into something else. Something intensely sharp and overwhelmingly possessive. He noticed the lack of hysteria in my voice. He noticed how my body was perfectly still beneath his. He noticed how quickly I identified a military-grade tracking device. "You know exactly what kind of tech the cartels use," Charles murmured. He lowered his head, yet his lips brushing against the shell of my ear. A cash-only clinic doctor doesn't know about shortwave burst transmitters. Who the hell are you, Maya? Before I could answer, the heavy steel door of the shipping container violently rattled. Someone was testing the outside padlock. And it wasn't Marco. Charles's reaction was instantaneous. He didn't scramble or rush. He simply rolled off me, his movements completely silent despite the agonizing pull on his fresh stitches. He reached under his pillow and pulled out the heavy pistol he had taken from my clinic. He checked the chamber in the dark, the metallic click sounding deafeningly loud in the cramped space. "Get behind the gun safe," he ordered, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. He grabbed my wrist, pulling me off the cot and shoving me into the dark corner behind the heavy steel cabinet bolted to the floor. "Do not make a sound. Do not come out until I tell you to." "You can't fight them," I hissed back, grabbing the front of his black t-shirt. "You just had major surgery. Your core temperature is still unstable. If you tear those internal sutures, you will bleed out before I can even open my bag." He looked down at my hands gripping his shirt. He didn't pull away. Instead, he raised his free hand, his rough thumb brushing lightly across my cheekbone. It was a shockingly tender gesture from a man holding a loaded gun. "I've survived worse than Reyes's street dogs," Charles whispered, leaning in so close I could feel the heat of his skin. "Stay hidden, Maya. If they get through that door, I kill the first two. So you take my gun and you shoot the third. Do you understand?" I stared up into his dark, ruthless eyes. He wasn't joking. He was entirely prepared to die defending this metal box. And he trusted me to finish the job if he fell. I swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand." The heavy padlock on the outside of the door rattled again, louder this time. The scrape of metal on metal echoed through the freezing bunker. Someone was trying to pry it open with a crowbar. Charles stepped away from me, moving seamlessly into the shadows beside the entrance. He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at the center of the steel door. His breathing was slow and measured. He was a predator waiting in the dark. Suddenly, a muffled shout rang out from the alleyway, followed immediately by the sickening thud of a heavy object hitting the side of the container. "Boss!" a familiar, rough voice yelled through the thick steel. "It's Marco, open the door!" Charles didn't lower his weapon. He kept his aim steady, his jaw locked tight. "What's the passcode, Marco?" he barked through the metal. "Blood and iron," Marco shouted back, his voice strained and completely out of breath. "Boss, you need to open it right now. We have a massive problem." Charles finally lowered the gun. He slid the heavy deadbolt back and shoved the door open. The freezing morning fog poured into the bunker, followed immediately by Marco. The enforcer was bleeding from a cut above his hairline, his chest heaving. But he wasn't alone. He was dragging a man by the collar of his jacket, throwing him hard onto the metal floor of our container. It was one of Reyes' cartel scouts. The man was groaning, clutching a broken nose, but his eyes were darting around the bunker, taking in the cots, the medical supplies, and me. "I caught him sniffing around the perimeter," Marco growled, kicking the scout's legs to keep him down. He had a signal receiver in his pocket. He was tracking the bug. Charles looked down at the bleeding cartel soldier. The brief moment of tenderness he had shown me a minute ago was completely gone. He was the mafia boss again, cold, calculated, and terrifying. "Are there more of you?" Charles asked, his voice dead flat. The scout spat blood onto the floor and sneered. "Our whole crew is locking down the port. You're a dead man, Charles. Reyes sent 100 men to find you, and they know exactly where that tracker is." Charles didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head to look at me, standing in the shadows by the gun safe. He looked at the micro-tracker still gripped tightly in my hand. Then a slow, dark smirk spread across his face. "Maya," Charles said, his voice laced with a dangerous kind of amusement. "How good is your throwing arm?" I looked at the tracker in my palm, and suddenly I understood exactly what he was planning. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to use Julian's betrayal against them. "I'm a doctor," I replied, stepping out of the shadows. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice perfectly steady, matching his dark energy. "My hands are very precise." Charles let out a low, rough laugh. It was an incredible sound. He looked at Marco. "Tie him up and gag him. Bet we leave the container in 2 minutes." He turned back to me, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made my breath hitch. We're going to take a little walk to the edge of the docks. Let's see how well Reyes men can swim. My hands were very precise. I was a surgeon after all. Marco didn't waste a single second. He ripped a roll of heavy duct tape from the medical supplies and bound the cartel scout's wrists and ankles tight, finishing by securing a thick piece of tape over the man's bleeding mouth. The scout thrashed against the metal floor, but Marco shoved him brutally under the narrow military cot, completely hiding him from view. 2 minutes, Charles repeated, his voice tight with pain. He gripped the edge of the heavy gun safe, his knuckles turning white as he forced himself to stand completely straight. Now I could see the sheer agony flashing behind his dark eyes. The veterinary antibiotics had stopped the infection, but his abdominal muscles had literally just been sliced open and sewn back together. I didn't ask for permission. I stepped directly into his space and slipped my arm around his waist, wedging my shoulder firmly under his good arm. Charles stiffened for a fraction of a second, his massive frame freezing at the sudden contact. Then with a heavy, ragged exhale, he let his weight settle against me. The heat radiating through his black t-shirt seeped instantly into my skin. "Don't get used to carrying me, Maya," he murmured, his breath brushing the top of my head. "Just focus on putting one foot in front of the other," I whispered back, my grip tightening on his waist. "If you bleed out on me now, I'm leaving you on the docks." A low, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Liar." Marco cracked the heavy steel door open, leading with the barrel of his shotgun. The freezing morning fog had rolled in thick off the ocean, turning the maze of towering shipping containers into a gray, ghostly labyrinth. It was the perfect cover. "Clear," Marco grunted, stepping out into the damp alleyway. We moved as fast as Charles's body would allow. Every step we took away from the bunker was a massive risk. The air smelled heavily of salt, rusted iron, and the sharp tang of diesel fuel. I kept my hand clamped tightly around the magnetic micro-tracker in my pocket, its tiny red light pulsing against the fabric of my sweatpants like a heartbeat. We slipped between two massive red shipping crates, and hiding deep in the shadows, just as a pair of heavily armed cartel soldiers jogged past the end of the alley. My breath caught in my throat. We were close enough to hear the safety click off one of their rifles. Charles pulled me flush against his chest, pressing us both flat against the cold, corrugated steel of the container. His hand came up, wrapping warmly around the back of my neck to tuck my face into his shoulder, shielding me completely from view. He was burning up again, running purely on adrenaline and violent instinct, but wrapped in his arms, I had never felt safer in my entire life. When the footsteps finally faded, Charles looked down at me. "The water," he commanded softly. "Go." We broke from the shadows, moving quickly toward the edge of the industrial pier. The dark, churning ocean crashed heavily against the concrete pylons below. About 50 yards out, a massive, rusted garbage barge was slowly making its way out of the harbor, heading toward the open sea. "There," Charles pointed, his breathing ragged as he leaned his full weight against a wooden piling. "Can you make that throw?" I pulled the blinking tracker out of my pocket. It was heavy, solid metal. I didn't hesitate. I stepped right up to the edge of the concrete drop-off, squared my shoulders, and threw the device as hard as I possibly could. We watched the tiny red light arc high over the dark water. It hit the massive pile of scrap metal on the moving barge with a faint metallic clink, instantly blending into the trash. "Perfect," Marco breathed from the shadows. Less than 30 seconds later, the harbor erupted. Yet we watched from the darkness as dozens of Reyes cartel soldiers swarmed the docks, their weapons raised, screaming orders at each other as they chased the blinking red signal moving steadily out to sea on the garbage barge. They were completely leaving the shipping yard. Charles let out a long, heavy breath, his eyes slipping shut for a moment as the immediate danger passed. "Marco," he rasped, "get the car." "Already on it, boss," Marco said, leading the way back through the fog toward the alley where we had parked the nondescript blue sedan. The adrenaline was finally starting to crash, leaving my legs feeling like lead. I kept my arm tightly around Charles's waist, feeling the heavy, steady thud of his heart against my side. We had actually done it. We had outsmarted a cartel hit squad. For a brief, naive second, I thought the worst was over. We rounded the final corner of the alley, stepping out of the thick fog toward the parked car. It was untouched. The dark tinted windows were covered in a thin layer of morning dew. Marco unlocked the doors, his eyes scanning the empty shipping yard one last time. "Get him in the back, Doc." I helped Charles slide into the heavy leather seats of the sedan. The moment his weight left my shoulders, the sheer exhaustion of the last 12 hours hit me like a physical blow. My hands were shaking again, not from fear this time, but from the massive adrenaline crash. I climbed in right beside him, pulling the heavy car door shut. The thick glass completely muted the sounds of the crashing ocean outside. Marco slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, but he didn't put the car in drive. Yet he looked at Charles through the rearview mirror, his face grim. "Boss, we can't go to the Narrows," Marco said quietly. "I just checked the encrypted comms. Reyes isn't just locking down the port. He's shaking down the entire south side. That safe house is compromised." Charles let his head fall back against the leather headrest, his jaw clenching in raw frustration. The veterinary antibiotics were holding the infection at bay, but his body was battered. He needed a sterile environment, real rest, and a fortress. "Then we drop off the map entirely," Charles rasped, his voice dark and dangerous. "Take us to the mountain house, the one not on any ledger." Marco's eyes widened slightly in the mirror. "The glass house? Boss, no one has been up there in years. It's completely isolated." We won't have any backup." "Exactly," Charles growled. "Nobody knows it exists. Not the families, not the cartel, just us." Marco nodded once, slamming the car into gear. The sedan tore out of the alley, leaving the freezing, rusted harbor behind us. I pressed my back against the passenger door, staring out the window as the gray industrial district blurred into thick, dark forests. The hidden mountain house. I had just traded a steel shipping container for a mafia ghost cabin. My old life was gone, burned to the ground the second Charles crashed into my clinic. Now, I was vanishing off the face of the earth with him. I wrapped my arms around my chest, suddenly feeling incredibly cold in my oversized bleach-scented clothes. A warm, calloused hand suddenly slid across the dark leather seat, wrapping firmly around my wrist. I gasped softly, turning my head. Charles had shifted closer to me. The space between us in the back seat had vanished. His dark eyes were hooded with exhaustion, but the possessive intensity burning in them pinned me entirely to the spot. He didn't pull me aggressively, but his grip was an anchor. He slowly dragged my hand across the seat, intertwining his thick, rough fingers with mine. He rested our joined hands on his thigh, right next to the pistol tucked into his waistband. "You're shaking, Maya," he murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated in the quiet car. "It's just the adrenaline," I lied, unable to look away from his mouth. "I'm fine." He leaned in closer, the smell of him, dark leather and raw danger washed over me. He raised his free hand, his knuckles brushing lightly against my pale cheek. You aren't just a doctor anymore. And you aren't a hostage." His thumb traced the line of my jaw, sending a violent shiver straight down my spine. "We are going somewhere no one can ever find us," Charles whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "You belong to me now, and nobody touches what is mine." The drive up the mountain was a blur of towering pines and winding treacherous dirt roads. The heavy silence in the back of the sedan was broken only by the rhythmic thud of the tires and Charles's deep, measured breathing. He hadn't let go of my hand. His thick fingers remained firmly intertwined with mine, a silent, burning brand that tethered me to him in the dark. Every time I tried to pull away, just a fraction of an inch to regain my sanity, his grip tightened. It wasn't forceful, but it was an absolute refusal to let me slip away. Hours bled into one another as Marco navigated higher into the dense, ancient forest. The gray morning light struggled to pierce through the thick canopy of trees. My old life in the city felt like a lifetime ago. I was no longer Dr. Maya, the disgraced resident hiding in a basement clinic. I was a ghost, disappearing into the clouds with a man who ruled the underworld. Finally, the sedan tires crunched over a bed of overgrown gravel, rolling to a slow halt. I looked out the tinted window and my breath caught in my throat. The mountain house wasn't a rustic cabin. It was a sprawling, modern fortress, a dark steel and floor-to-ceiling tinted glass, built directly into the jagged edge of a cliff. It was completely swallowed by the forest, invisible from the air, am invisible from the valley below. It was beautiful and entirely isolated. Marco killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He turned around in the driver's seat, his face shadowed and grim. "I'm not staying, boss," Marco said softly, his eyes flicking to the fuel gauge. "If I park this car here, it's a beacon if Reyes somehow manages to put a drone in the air. I need to drive it 50 miles north, dump it in a ravine, and hike back to the nearest highway to steal something clean. I'll get us food, heavy winter gear, and more medical supplies." Charles slowly opened his eyes, the exhaustion heavy on his face, but his mind sharp as glass. "How long, Marco?" 72 hours, the enforcer replied, his jaw tight. "I'll circle back and secure the perimeter. But until I return, you are completely on your own. No comms. And no backup." Charles gave a single slow nod. "Go. Stay off the main roads." Marco got out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He opened the back door, and the biting, freezing mountain air flooded the cabin. I shivered instantly in my thin cotton t-shirt. Charles finally released my hand, the sudden absence of his heat leaving my skin cold. I scrambled out of the car, grabbing my plastic pharmacy basket. Marco helped Charles to his feet, letting the boss brace heavily against his shoulder as we walked toward the heavy, matte black front door. Charles punched a 6-digit code into a hidden keypad. The deadbolts clicked with a heavy, mechanical thud, and the door swung open. The interior was immaculate, freezing, and smelled faintly of cedar and dust. White canvas sheets covered the massive modern furniture. Beyond the living room, now the entire back wall was made of glass, overlooking a terrifying, breathtaking drop into a misty gorge. Marco helped Charles onto a long leather sofa in the center of the room, pulling the canvas sheet away just in time. Charles sank into the cushions with a low, agonizing groan, his hand gripping his side. "Keep him breathing, Doc," Marco said, looking at me with a heavy, unspoken trust. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel, walked out the front door, and locked us in. A moment later, the sound of the sedan's engine fired up, slowly fading down the mountain road until the silence of the forest swallowed it completely. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the massive glass living room. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a wave of ice water. I was 70 miles from civilization, locked in a mafia safe house, completely alone with him. "You're standing a mile away, Maya," Charles rasped, his voice pulling me out of my panic. I turned to look at him. He was leaning back against the dark leather, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The adrenaline was entirely gone, and the sheer physical toll of the last 12 hours was catching up to him fast. His skin was pale, and a fresh sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. "I need to check your stitches," I said, my voice sounding incredibly small in the massive, echoing house. "You walk too much. If you tore the internal suturing, you're going to bleed into your abdominal cavity." "Then come here," he commanded softly, his dark eyes never leaving my face. I crossed the room, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor, and I knelt on the rug beside the sofa, suddenly hyper-aware of how massive he was, taking up the entire couch. My hands hovered over the hem of his black t-shirt. "Lift your arms," I instructed, trying to keep my tone strictly professional. He didn't argue. He raised his arms, his teeth grinding together as his injured muscles protested. I gripped the fabric of his shirt and slowly pulled it over his head, tossing it onto the floor. My breath hitched. Without the blood-soaked dress shirt or the heavy shadows of the bunker, I could finally see the sprawling canvas of his tattoos, in the natural light pouring through the glass walls. Dark ink wrapped around his thick biceps, snaking across his broad chest. Symbols of power, violence, and loyalty that I couldn't decipher. But it was the raw, heavy musculature of his chest and abdomen that made my mouth go dry. He was built like a weapon. I forced my eyes down to the thick gauze pad taped to his side. I carefully peeled the surgical tape back, wincing in sympathy as it pulled at his skin. The wound was angry and bruised, the edges inflamed, but the heavy black thread of my stitches had held. The bleeding had stopped. "You're incredibly lucky," I breathed, my shoulders dropping with massive relief. "It held. The antibiotics are keeping the infection localized. You just need to stay completely horizontal." I reached for a fresh alcohol wipe from my basket, gently cleaning the dried blood from the edges of his skin. My fingers brushed against the hard ridge of his hip bone, and I felt a violent shudder ripple through his entire body. I froze, looking up at his face. "Yeah, did I hurt you?" "No," Charles murmured, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, gravelly vibration that sent a flush of heat straight up my neck. His dark eyes weren't looking at the wound. They were locked onto my face, tracking the nervous flutter of my eyelashes, the way I bit my bottom lip when I was concentrating. The air in the freezing glass house suddenly felt impossibly heavy, thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand wrapping warmly around my wrist, stopping my movements entirely. "You saved my life twice in one night," Charles whispered, his thumb slowly stroking the delicate skin of my inner wrist. "You dragged me out of a cartel ambush, and you threw a tracker into the ocean without blinking." "I was just trying to survive," I countered. My voice betraying me with a slight tremble. "Look at me, Maya," he commanded softly. I slowly dragged my gaze up to meet his. The sheer intensity in his dark eyes stripped away every defense I had left. There was no mafia boss in this room. No guns, no hit squads. It was just a man, looking at me like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "You could have let me die on that dog table," Charles said, his grip on my wrist shifting, his hand sliding up my forearm to cup the side of my face. His palm was rough, but his touch was shockingly gentle. "But you didn't. You stayed." I leaned into his touch without meaning to, my eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second, as the warmth of his hand chased away the mountain chill. "I told you, I don't let people die." "I'm not people," Charles murmured, and his thumb brushing across my cheekbone. "And you aren't just my doctor anymore." He leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his side. His face moved agonizingly close to mine, his ragged, warm breath washing over my lips. My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic, captive bird. I couldn't move. I didn't want to. "We are entirely alone up here, Maya," he whispered, his dark eyes dropping to my mouth. "For the next 3 days, it is just you and me, and I need you to understand something." "What?" I breathed, the word barely making a sound. He smiled at me and then, he said, "Never mind." My heart sank into my stomach. What he is thinking about? "But beware, Marco, and I will protect you." I stared down into Charles's dark, exhausted eyes, my breath completely trapped in my lungs. There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of a bluff. He was a man who commanded thousands of men, a man who orchestrated violence with the flick of a wrist, and he was looking at me with a raw, consuming hunger that terrified me just as much as it thrilled me. I couldn't look away. I was completely paralyzed by the heat radiating from his skin and the heavy, calloused hand cupping my cheek. But then a sharp, involuntary shiver racked his massive frame. His skin was still too pale, the edges of his lips losing their color. The adrenaline that had carried him up the mountain was finally completely gone. His body was crashing, and the freezing air of the unheated mountain house was pulling his core temperature down fast. The doctor in me violently overpowered the captive. I gently wrapped my fingers around his thick wrist and pulled his hand away from my face, and I didn't let go of him. But I broke the hypnotic spell he had cast over me. "You can't protect anyone if you freeze to death on a leather sofa," I whispered, my voice trembling just a little as I forced myself to step back. "You are going into a post-adrenaline crash. We need to get you into a real bed, Charles, right now." He let out a rough, breathy exhale, his head falling back against the cushions. He didn't argue. He knew his limits, and right now he was entirely at my mercy. Down the hall he rasped, his eyes sliding shut. "Last door on the right." I quickly grabbed the heavy canvas sheet I had pulled off the sofa and draped it over his bare chest to hold on to whatever body heat he had left. I stepped in close, wrapping my arm firmly around his waist and bracing my shoulder beneath his. "On 3, I instructed. 1, not 2, 3. Charles gritted his teeth, a low, guttural groan tearing from his throat as he forced himself off the couch. His sheer size was overwhelming. Without Marco here to take the brunt of his weight, I had to plant my feet hard against the hardwood floor just to keep us both from collapsing. Every muscle in his body was locked in absolute agony. We moved at a slow pace down the long, dark hallway. The only sound was our synchronized, heavy breathing and the faint howling of the mountain wind against the thick glass windows. I pushed the heavy oak door open with my shoulder, stepping into the master suite. It was massive, shadowy, and bitterly cold. A giant king-size bed dominated the center of the room, covered in thick, dark gray wool blankets and heavy down comforters. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the mist-covered gorge, casting a pale, ghostly light across the hardwood floor. I guided Charles to the edge of the mattress. He sank onto the bed heavily, his elbows resting on his knees as he fought to catch his breath. His head hung low, the dark strands of his hair falling over his forehead. He looked incredibly vulnerable, a fallen king hiding in a glass tower. I didn't waste a second. I pulled the heavy blankets back and grabbed the pillows, stacking them against the solid oak headboard. "Swing your legs up," I commanded softly, keeping my voice perfectly steady to hide my own exhaustion. "Careful with the abdominal muscles. Let your arms do the work." He followed my instructions, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked violently in his cheek, and he slid his legs onto the mattress and leaned back against the pillows. I immediately pulled the thick wool blankets up to his chest, tucking them firmly around his broad shoulders to trap the heat. I stood beside the bed, watching his chest rise and fall. His eyes were closed, his breathing still too shallow. The house was essentially a giant icebox, and it would take hours for the ambient temperature to rise, even if I managed to find the climate controls. I walked into the adjoining master bathroom, my slip-resistant shoes echoing on the cold stone tiles. I found a stack of thick, clean towels in a cabinet. I ran the heavy brass faucet, soaking 2 hand towels in the hottest water I could get, wringing them out until they were steaming. When I walked back into the bedroom, Charles hadn't moved. Then the room was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. I sat cautiously on the very edge of the king-sized mattress. The springs didn't even creak under my weight. I took the warm, damp towel and gently pressed it against his pale forehead, wiping away the cold sweat and the last traces of grime from the harbor. Charles sighed, a low, rumbling sound deep in his chest. He didn't open his eyes, but he leaned his head slightly into my touch. I moved the warm towel down the sharp line of his jaw, wiping the dried blood from a cut near his ear. The contrast between us was staggering. My hands were small, pale, and trembling with exhaustion, while his skin was thick, scarred, and covered in the dark ink of a violent life. Yet, in this freezing, isolated room, he was completely yielding to me. You're freezing, Maya." His voice broke the silence, rough and impossibly quiet. I paused, the warm towel hovering over his neck. I hadn't realized my teeth were practically chattering. The oversized, bleach-scented t-shirt Julian had given me offered absolutely no protection against the mountain air. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice betraying me with a slight quiver. "I just need to keep your core temperature stable. The antibiotics are working, but the cold is going to stress your system." Charles finally opened his eyes. In the dim, gray light of the bedroom, his dark gaze was piercing. He looked at my crossed arms, the way my shoulders were hunched against the chill. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his heavy arm, peeling back the thick wool blanket on the empty side of the massive bed. "Get in," he ordered. My heart stalled completely. I stared at the dark, warm space beside him, and then back up at his face. "Charles, I can't. You have an open surgical wound. If I roll over or if you move the wrong way—" "I'm not asking, Maya," he interrupted, his voice dropping to that dangerous, velvet rumble that left absolutely no room for argument. "You're shivering. If you catch a fever up here, neither of us survives. The bed is massive. Get under the blankets." I swallowed hard, my throat completely dry. Logic told me to find another blanket, to sleep on the floor, to put distance between myself and the mafia boss. The spare rooms are not conducive for me to sleep in. But the mountain cold was seeping deep into my bones, and the look in his eyes promised that he wouldn't take no for an answer. I kicked off my ruined shoes and slowly crawled onto the mattress. I stayed as close to the edge as physically possible, sliding under the heavy wool covers. The immediate warmth trapped beneath the blankets was heavenly, but it was completely eclipsed by the overwhelming heat radiating from the man lying just inches away from me. I lay flat on my back, staring up at the dark ceiling, my body completely rigid. I was so hyper-aware of him that I could practically feel the electricity jumping the gap between our bodies. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind outside the glass. Then I heard the rustle of the heavy fabric. Charles shifted his weight, wincing softly. Before I could ask if he was okay, his massive arm slid across the mattress. His hand found my waist in the dark, and his thick fingers wrapping warmly around my hip. With one smooth, unavoidable pull, he dragged me across the sheets until my back was pressed flush against his solid, burning side. I gasped, the breath completely knocked out of me. "Charles," I whispered, my voice frantic. "Your stitches are fine," he murmured, his face burying into the curve of my neck. His ragged breath washed over my collarbone, sending a violent shiver of pure heat straight to my core. "Stop fighting me, Maya." He didn't try to restrain my arms or force me to turn around. He simply wrapped his heavy arm completely around my waist, pulling me flush against him so that my smaller frame was entirely enveloped by his heat. He was a human furnace. "You saved my life," Charles whispered into the dark, his deep voice vibrating against my spine. "Now let me keep you warm." I stopped fighting. I let out a long, shaky exhale, my body finally relaxing into the hard, protective curve of his chest. The smell of cedar, rain, and him surrounded me completely. But as his breathing slowed, and his heavy arm held me secure against the dark, I closed my eyes, realizing I didn't want to be anywhere else because of the cold. I woke up to the blinding, sterile light of a mountain morning. The heavy weight draped across my waist wasn't a blanket. It was an arm. I froze, my eyes snapping open. The memory of the chaotic night, the cartel hit squad, and the terrifying drive up the mountain all came rushing back in a violent wave. I was lying in a massive king-sized bed in a glass fortress, completely enveloped by the man who ran the city's criminal underworld. Charles was still deeply asleep, and his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm against my spine. His fever had entirely broken. The burning, dangerous heat from last night had settled into a steady, comforting warmth that made it incredibly difficult to move. His face was buried in the curve of my neck, his dark hair brushing against my collarbone. I took a slow, shallow breath, trying not to disturb him. As a doctor, I knew his body was doing exactly what it needed to do. The sheer trauma of the gunshot, the infection, and the blood loss required massive amounts of deep, uninterrupted sleep for his cells to repair. But as a woman, lying trapped against a lethally dangerous man who had just claimed I belonged to him, my heart was beating a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I had to get up. I needed to assess our supplies, find water, and figure out how to survive the next 3 days before Marco returned. I carefully reached down, wrapping my fingers around his thick, heavily tattooed forearm. I held my breath, slowly lifting his heavy arm off my waist just an inch at a time. He groaned softly, a low, rough vibration that sent a shockwave of heat straight through my core. His brow furrowed in his sleep, his instinctual grip tightening for a second before his muscles finally went slack. I slipped out from under the heavy down comforter, my bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood floor. The cold was absolute shock. The mountain house had no central heating running, and the floor-to-ceiling windows were coated in a thick layer of white frost. We were completely encased in the clouds. I let Charles sleep while I tiptoed out of the room. The sheer scale of the house was intimidating in the daylight. I padded quietly down the long hallway, my oversized gray sweatpants swallowing my legs. The living room was a modern masterpiece of dark steel, leather, and glass, completely untouched and sterile. I found the kitchen tucked behind a massive stone fireplace. It was sleek, minimalist, and thankfully not entirely empty. I opened the dark mahogany cabinets one by one. Whoever maintained this ghost house kept it strictly stocked for emergencies. There were rows of bottled water, vacuum-sealed protein bars, a medical trauma kit, and a heavy cast-iron French press with a bag of whole coffee beans. It wasn't a feast, but it was survival. I found a sleek electric kettle and filled it with bottled water, flipping the switch. As the water began to boil, I leaned heavily against the cold marble counter, burying my face in my hands. The adrenaline was entirely gone, leaving nothing but a crushing, hollow exhaustion. I had lost everything. My clinic, my quiet, hidden life, my safety. I was officially a ghost. If the Reyes cartel found out I was still alive, They would hunt me to the ends of the earth. And the only thing standing between me and a cartel execution was a mafia boss who looked at me like I was a possession he refused to surrender. A sudden heavy thud echoed from the hallway. My head snapped up. Before I could even step away from the counter, the shadow of a massive frame filled the kitchen doorway. Charles stood there, barefoot, wearing only the dark sweatpants Julian had given him. He had ripped the heavy bandages off his torso, exposing the angry, bruised skin around the thick black sutures I had sewn into his side. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood to keep himself upright. In his right hand, hanging loosely by his side, was the heavy black pistol. "You left the bed," Charles rasped. His voice was a dark, gravelly scrape that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. He wasn't fully awake. The exhaustion and the residual painkillers were still clouding his eyes, leaving only raw, violent instinct. He had woken up, felt the empty space beside him, and immediately grabbed his weapon. "Charles," I said softly, keeping my hands perfectly visible as I took a slow step toward him. "Put the gun down, it's just me." His dark, heavy gaze swept the empty kitchen, eye checking the frost-covered windows before finally locking onto my face. He blinked, the lethal tension in his massive shoulders slowly unraveling as his brain registered that we were alone, that we were safe. He lowered the pistol, setting it heavily onto the marble island. "You shouldn't be walking," I scolded him, the doctor in me instantly overriding my fear. I crossed the kitchen and grabbed his elbow, wrapping my arm around his waist to support his weight. "You have 0 blood volume. If you pass out and hit this marble floor, you'll crack your skull." He didn't argue. He let out a ragged sigh, leaning his heavy frame against me as I guided him toward one of the dark leather bar stools. "I woke up," Charles muttered, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble right next to my ear. "Yeah, when you were gone." "I was 50 feet away making coffee," I countered, reaching for a bottle of water and twisting the cap off. I pressed it into his hand. "Drink. All of it. You need to rehydrate before your kidneys start shutting down." He took the plastic bottle, downing half the water in 3 massive swallows. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his dark eyes never leaving my face. He watched me as I pulled the French press down from the cabinet, my movements jerky and nervous under his intense, predatory stare. "You're shaking again, Maya," he observed quietly. "The floor is freezing," I lied, keeping my back to him as I poured the boiling water over the coffee grounds. "Look at me," he commanded. I stopped pouring. The silence in the house was so thick it felt like it was crushing my lungs. I slowly turned around, leaning my hips against the counter. Charles reached out, hooking his thick finger into the belt loop of my oversized sweatpants. With a slow, deliberate tug, he pulled me away from the counter and directly into the space between his spread knees. I gasped softly, my hands instinctively coming up to rest flat against his bare, heavily tattooed chest, to keep myself from crashing completely into him. His skin was burning hot beneath my palms. I could feel the heavy, steady thud of his heart against my fingertips. He didn't let me step back. His large hands settled firmly onto my hips, anchoring me exactly where he wanted me. "You are shaking because of the cold," Charles murmured, tilting his head up to look deeply into my eyes. "I so much want to kiss you right now. I have been thinking about kissing you. I really love to do it right now. How do you feel about it?" "I don't belong in your world, Charles," I breathed, my fingers unconsciously curling into the fabric of his sweatpants. "I save lives. You end them." A dark, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of his lips. He leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his side, until his face was inches from mine. "Maybe," Charles whispered, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl that vibrated straight through my chest. "But you saved mine, and that makes you an accomplice, Maya. There is no going back to the basement." His hand slid up my back, his wide palms spanning my spine as he pulled me flush against his chest. "You are in my world now," he promised into the quiet mountain air, "and I am never letting you leave." "How do you feel about it?" he asked again. "You are the kind of person worth kissing slowly," he whispered. His hands are already teasing me at my most sensitive places. The question hung in the freezing mountain air, heavy and loaded with a dark, terrifying promise. Charles didn't break eye contact. His large hands remained firmly anchored on my hips. his thumbs pressing into the soft fabric of my sweatpants. He wasn't forcing me. He was doing something much more dangerous. He was waiting for me to surrender. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Logic screamed at me to push him away, to remind him of his torn abdomen and the cartel hunting us down. I was a doctor. He was a ruthless criminal. But as I looked up into his dark, exhausted eyes, all of my logic completely shattered. I feel... My voice broke, coming out as a breathless, trembling whisper. Not like this is the most dangerous mistake I could possibly make. A slow, devastating smirk curved his lips. I've always loved dangerous things, Maya. He didn't wait for me to say another word. He let go of my hips, his massive hands sliding up my sides, his rough palms dragging against my ribs, until his fingers tangled deep into the hair at the nape of my neck. He tilted my head back, exposing my throat. His grip secure, possessive, and entirely inescapable. And then he finally kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't a frantic, adrenaline-fueled collision. It was slow, deliberate, and impossibly deep. A slow-burning fire that instantly consumed every single defense I had left. His lips were warm and demanding, parting mine with a soft, authoritative pressure. I gasped into his mouth, my hands instinctively sliding up his bare, a heavily tattooed chest. I gripped his broad shoulders, my fingernails digging into his skin, as my knees went completely weak. The marble counter at my back was freezing, but everywhere he touched me felt like it was melting. He groaned, a low guttural vibration deep in his chest that sent a shockwave of pure liquid heat straight to my core. His tongue swept over my bottom lip, tasting me, claiming me in the quiet isolation of the glass house. He kissed me like a man who had been starving in the dark his entire life, finally finding a singular drop of sunlight. I kissed him back. I couldn't stop myself. My hands moved up to his jaw, my fingers tracing the rough, day-old stubble on his cheek. The smell of rich coffee brewing behind us mixed with his dark, cedar scent. We were completely cut off from the rest of the world. And in his arms, the rest of the world ceased to exist. He deepened the kiss, his body pressing heavier against mine. He shifted his stance, trying to pull me flush against his hips. But the sudden movement pulled violently at his torn abdominal muscles. Charles tore his mouth away from mine with a sharp, ragged hiss of pain. His head dropped, resting heavily against my forehead as he fought to catch his breath. His massive frame shuddered against me, his muscles locking up in absolute agony. The burning heat of his skin instantly turned to a cold, clammy sweat. "Charles," I breathed, my eyes flying open. The hazy fog of desire vanished in a split second, completely replaced by pure medical panic. "You tore the sutures. I told you not to move." "I'm fine," he gritted out through clenched teeth. But his legs buckled slightly, his dead weight suddenly crashing against me. "You are not fine." I grabbed his waist, bracing my feet hard against the floor to keep him from collapsing onto the kitchen tiles. "Lean on me. We have to get you back to the bed right now." He didn't argue this time. The brief flare of possessive dominance had entirely drained whatever reserves of strength he had left. I guided him out of the kitchen, practically dragging him down the long, freezing hallway. Every step was a battle. His breathing grew shallow and rapid, the classic signs of physical shock setting in. We stumbled through the oak doors of the master suite. I managed to pivot him toward the mattress, and he collapsed heavily onto the dark wool blankets with a sickening groan. He curled onto his uninjured side, his eyes squeezing shut as he clutched his abdomen. And I scrambled onto the massive bed beside him, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I reached for the edge of the thick gauze pad taped to his side. "Let me see," I demanded, peeling the tape back just enough to inspect the damage. A fresh, dark stain of red was blooming across the white cotton. He had popped one of the superficial stitches, but thankfully the deep muscle closures I had done on the dog table were still holding. He wasn't bleeding out, but the pain had to be absolute torture. "You ripped a surface stitch," I whispered, pressing a clean folded towel firmly against the wound to stop the slow leak of blood. "You have to stay still, Charles. You are pushing your body way past its breaking point." He let out a long, shaky exhale, his head resting against the dark pillows. He slowly opened his eyes, Ed looking up at me as I kneeled over him in the dim light of the bedroom. Despite the sheer agony radiating through his body, that dark, dangerous smirk returned to his pale lips. "It was worth it," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared down at him, my heart doing a painful, erratic flip inside my chest. I pressed the towel harder against his side, forcing myself to look at the wound instead of his eyes. "You are an absolute idiot," I muttered, though the anger in my voice was entirely fake, completely betrayed by the breathless tremble in my words. Charles reached up, his heavy, exhausted hand wrapping loosely around my wrist. His thumb brushed over my racing pulse point. "And you," he murmured, his dark eyes closing as the exhaustion finally pulled him under. "Mom, are entirely mine. Come here," he whispered. "I want more." Before I could say a word, he leaned over and started kissing me. He whispered, "I will be careful." I had to trust him for saying that. Just making out, that's all. I felt renewed, praying for that moment not to be over. In the evening, my hands were steady now, but my heart was still beating wildly against my ribs. I could still taste the dark, bitter notes of the coffee on my tongue, mixed with the sheer, consuming heat of his mouth. I carefully pulled the ruined tape away. The surface stitch had definitely snapped, but the deeper muscle layers were secure. I reached into my plastic basket, pulling out a packet of butterfly closures. I didn't want to use a needle on him while he was passed out. I carefully pinched the edges of the angry red skin together, securing them tightly with the adhesive strips before taping a fresh, thick gauze pad over the entire area. He didn't flinch. The exhaustion had pulled him incredibly deep under. I stood up, my knees trembling slightly, and pulled the heavy wool blankets back up to his chest. The mountain house was growing colder by the minute. The pale gray light bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows was starting to fade into a bruised, deep violet. Night was falling over the gorge, and with it came a freezing, bitter chill that seeped right through the glass walls. I couldn't just sit in the dark and wait for us to freeze. I left the bedroom, my bare feet completely numb against the hardwood floors. I walked back into the massive living room, heading straight for the colossal stone fireplace. Marco hadn't had time to chop fresh wood, but there was a neat stack of thick, dry cedar logs sitting on the iron grate, along with a box of long matches on the mantel. I knelt on the cold stone hearth, my hands shaking as I arranged the kindling. I struck a match, the sudden flare of orange light practically blinding in the dim, shadowy room. I touched the flame to the dry wood. Within minutes, a roaring fire cracked and hissed in the earth, casting long, dancing shadows across the white canvas covers of the furniture. The heat radiating from the stone was absolute heaven. I sat back on my heels, pulling my knees to my chest and wrapping my arms tightly around my legs. I stared into the flames, my mind racing back to the kitchen. I had let a mafia boss kiss me, and I had kissed him back. I had grabbed his shoulders and pulled him closer, and completely surrendering to a man who lived and breathed violence. I had spent years hiding in the shadows, terrified of the cartels, terrified of the underworld. And yet, when Charles backed me against that marble counter, I hadn't felt a single ounce of fear. I had only felt a dark, desperate need. A heavy scrape of footsteps against the hardwood floor pulled me violently out of my thoughts. I spun around. Charles was standing in the hallway archway. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his dark sweatpants hanging low on his hips, his massive tattooed chest illuminated by the flickering orange firelight. He looked like a dark god forged out of the shadows. "I thought I told you to stay in bed," I said, my voice breathless, the reprimand completely failing to sound authoritative. "I woke up freezing," he rasped, as his voice rough from sleep. He pushed off the doorframe, taking slow, agonizingly measured steps toward the fire. And the bed was completely empty. Again. I stood up quickly, moving to intercept him before his legs gave out. I slipped my arm around his waist, letting him brace his heavy frame against my shoulder. He let out a low, rough sigh, his arm wrapping heavily around my back. "You shouldn't be walking," I whispered, guiding him toward the thick, dark rug directly in front of the roaring fire. "You popped a stitch in the kitchen, Charles. I had to butterfly it closed. If you tear the deep sutures, I have absolutely no way to stop the internal bleeding." "Then keep me still," he murmured, his breath hot against the side of my neck. I helped him lower his massive frame onto the thick rug, right in front of the stone hearth. Yet the heat of the fire immediately washed over his pale skin. He leaned back on his elbows, wincing as his abdominal muscles pulled tight, before finally stretching his long legs out toward the flames. I grabbed one of the heavy down comforters I had dragged out of the hall closet earlier, wrapping it firmly around his broad shoulders. I started to pull away, intending to sit on the opposite side of the hearth, but his hand shot out, his thick fingers wrapping securely around my wrist. "Sit with me," Charles commanded softly. He didn't pull me aggressively, but the heavy, unspoken weight of that kiss was hanging thick in the air between us. I couldn't deny him. I didn't want to. I sank onto the rug right beside him, tucking my legs beneath me. The fire popped, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. We sat in the quiet isolation of the mountain house, surrounded by nothing but miles of dark, freezing forest. Charles turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto my face. The orange firelight danced across the sharp line of his jaw and the deep, sprawling ink on his chest. He was watching me with that same intense, calculating focus that made my pulse race. "Why did you hide in the Narrows, Maya?" he asked suddenly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "A surgeon with your skills doesn't end up in a cash-only basement clinic by accident." I looked away, staring into the flames. The walls I had built around my past were thick, but the sheer vulnerability of this glass house was stripping them away piece by piece. "I told you, I stole medical supplies," I answered quietly. "Yuck, you stole supplies to treat people the cartels tortured," Charles corrected him softly, his heavy gaze pinning me in place. "You said you patched up soldiers south of the border. You didn't just get caught stealing from a hospital, Maya. You ran. Who were you running from?" My breath hitched. He was entirely too smart and completely relentless. "The Reyes cartel," I whispered, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. 3 years ago, they took over the clinic where I was doing my residency. They forced us to keep their men alive. If we failed, they killed the doctors. I wrapped my arms tighter around my knees, shivering despite the roaring fire. I managed to slip out in the back of a medical transport truck. I changed my name. I disappeared into the basement. And I swore I would never let that world touch me again. Charles was completely silent for a long moment. He didn't offer empty apologies. He understood the brutal reality of the underworld better than anyone. Slowly, he shifted his weight on the rug. He reached out, his warm, calloused hand cupping the side of my face, forcing me to look away from the fire and directly into his dark, ruthless eyes. "You ran from Reyes," Charles murmured, his thumb brushing a slow, comforting arc across my cheekbone. "And you ended up perfectly in the path of the only man in this city who can completely wipe him off the map. You almost died last night," I reminded him, my voice trembling under his intense stare. "You aren't invincible, Charles." "I am when I have you," he countered, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. Yet he leaned in closer, his thumb tracing the line of my bottom lip. "Reyes made you a prisoner, Maya. He made you hide in the dark." His hand slid to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, as he pulled me a fraction of an inch closer. "I am going to burn his entire empire to the ground for what he did to you," Charles promised, the dark vow vibrating against my lips. "And when the ash settles, I am going to give you the world." The next 48 hours in the glass house blurred into a quiet, intense isolation, a world built entirely for 2 people. Outside, the mountain storm raged, battering the thick floor-to-ceiling windows with freezing rain and howling wind. But inside, the heavy stone fireplace kept the cold at bay, and the terrifying reality of the cartel felt a million miles away. Charles's recovery was nothing short of a medical miracle. Driven by a dark, relentless, sheer willpower, his body fought off the last remnants of the infection. By the end of the 2nd day, the pale exhaustion had completely left his face, replaced by the lethal, calculating energy of a king preparing to take his throne back. He still moved with a stiff, careful grace to protect the deep sutures, but the raw power radiating from his massive frame was undeniable. I spent those 2 days watching him. I changed his bandages, forced him to drink water, and cooked whatever we could find in the pantry. But the dynamic between us had completely shifted. I was no longer just a doctor keeping a hostage taker alive. Every look he gave me, every accidental brush of his hand against mine in the narrow kitchen, yet was heavy with that dark vow he had made by the fire. He was claiming me, piece by piece. On the morning of the third day, the storm finally broke. A pale, freezing sunlight pierced through the glass, illuminating the dark hardwood floors. I was standing by the massive window, holding a hot mug of coffee and staring out at the breathtaking drop into the gorge, when I heard the unmistakable metallic slide of a gun being cocked. I turned around. Charles was standing by the heavy oak dining table. He was wearing a fresh black t-shirt that stretched tight across his broad chest, and his dark eyes were locked entirely on me. Resting on the polished wood between us was the heavy black pistol he had carried since the night my clinic was destroyed. "Come here, Maya," he commanded softly. I set my mug down on the windowsill, my pulse suddenly picking up speed. I crossed the room, stopping just on the other side of the table. I looked down at the weapon, a cold shiver running down my spine. "You shouldn't be messing with that. Your stitches—" "My stitches are fine," Charles interrupted, his voice a low, rough rumble. He stepped around the table, closing the distance between us until he was standing right behind me. "We leave this mountain today. Marco will be here within the hour, and we are going straight back into a war zone." He stepped even closer, his broad chest pressing flush against my back. The sheer heat of his body enveloped me instantly. He reached around my sides, his thick, calloused hands closing gently over my wrists. "You save lives, Maya," Charles whispered, his breath warm against the shell of my ear. "I know that. I respect it. But Reyes doesn't care about your vows. If his men get within 10 feet of you, I need to know you won't freeze." He guided my hands toward the table, forcing my fingers to wrap around the cold, heavy steel grip of the pistol. "I don't know how to shoot," I breathed, my hands trembling slightly under his firm grip. "I've never held one of these." "I know," he murmured. "That's why I'm teaching you." He didn't step back. Instead, he wrapped his arms completely around me, his massive hands covering mine to stabilize the heavy weapon. He raised my arms, aiming the unloaded barrel toward the empty stone fireplace across the room. The physical proximity was overwhelming. I was entirely surrounded by him, by his scent of cedar and dark danger, by the solid wall of muscle at my back. "Keep both eyes open," Charles instructed, at his deep voice vibrating against my spine. "Don't look at the target. Look at the front sight, right at the tip of the barrel. Put that dot exactly where you want the bullet to go." I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the metal sight, but it was nearly impossible with his lips brushing against my temple. "Your grip is too tight," he observed quietly. He slowly uncurled my tense fingers, repositioning them with agonizing slowness. His rough thumb dragged across my knuckles, sending a violent spark of heat straight through my veins. "Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. If you jerk your hand, you miss. And in my world, missing means you die." "Charles," I whispered, my voice cracking slightly, "I don't want to be a killer." He lowered our hands, the heavy gun resting against my thigh. He turned me around in his arms, at his dark eyes fierce and entirely unapologetic. "You are going to be whatever it takes to survive," he vowed, his hands coming up to cup my face. "I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone touch you. But if I am not in the room, if I am bleeding on the floor, I need you to be ruthless, Maya. Can you do that for me?" I looked up into his intense, consuming gaze. He wasn't trying to corrupt me. He was desperately trying to armor me for the violent reality of his life. I took a shaky breath, the terrified doctor finally fading into the shadows, and nodded. "Yes." A dark, incredibly proud smirk curved his lips. He leaned down, capturing my mouth in a hard, bruising kiss that tasted like coffee in absolute possession. I kissed him back, my hand sliding up his chest, twisting into the fabric of his shirt. It was a desperate, heavy collision, a final moment of stolen peace before the world came crashing back in. And then, the silence of the mountain was shattered. The heavy crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the glass walls. Charles broke the kiss instantly, his violent instincts taking over. He grabbed the pistol from my hand, chambering around with a lethal, metallic snap. He shoved me behind his broad shoulders, shielding me entirely with his body as he aimed the weapon straight at the front door. We waited in breathless silence. The heavy keypad on the deadbolt beeped 3 times. The lock clicked, and the thick matte black door swung open, letting a blast of freezing mountain air into the room. Marco stepped over the threshold. He was wearing a heavy tactical jacket, and his eyes were dark with exhaustion. Yet he lowered his rifle when he saw Charles standing there, but his expression was grim, tight with terrible news. "Boss," Marco said, his voice heavy, "the perimeter is clear. The SUV is gassed up and waiting outside." Charles didn't lower his gun right away. He studied his enforcer's face, his jaw clenching. "What is it, Marco? What happened in the city?" Marco swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second before looking back at his boss. "Reyes didn't just lock down the port," Marco explained quietly. "He hit the main estate. He completely bypassed the outer guards, because someone opened the gates for him from the inside." The air in the glass house turned absolutely to ice. Charles slowly lowered the pistol, a terrifying cold fury washing over his features. "A rat! In the main house." "Worse," Marco breathed, shaking his head. "Boss, she's back, and she's the one holding court with Reyes." The absolute silence that followed Marco's words was deafening. The air inside the glass house didn't just turn cold. It felt like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. I stood frozen behind Charles's massive frame, still feeling the phantom heat of his kiss on my lips, but the atmosphere had completely shattered. Charles slowly lowered the pistol. The calculating, possessive heat that had been in his eyes just moments ago vanished entirely, replaced by a terrifying hollow darkness. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth would crack. "She brought Reyes into my house," Charles rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried a lethal weight that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice trembling as I stepped out from behind him. I looked between Marco's grim face and Charles's rigid posture. "Charles, who is at the estate?" He didn't look at me right away. He stared at the heavy, matte black door, his grip on the gun tightening until his knuckles turned bone white. When he finally turned his head, the look in his eyes made my stomach drop straight to the floor. "Jolene," Charles answered, the name slicing through the room like a jagged knife. "My wife." The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. I actually took a step back, my spine colliding with the edge of the oak dining table. My mind spun wildly. A wife? He had a wife. For the last 3 days he had pulled me into his bed, had branded me with his touch, and promised to burn the city down to protect me. And he was married to the woman handing his empire over to a cartel. "Maya," Charles stepped toward me, his hand reaching out to grab my arm, but I instinctively flinched away. His hand dropped. A flash of raw pain crossed his features, quickly masked by the ruthless armor of the mafia boss. "We don't have time for this," Charles commanded, his voice turning hard and entirely professional. "She isn't family, she's a viper, and she has been exiled from the city for 2 years. If she is sitting at my table with Reyes, it means she is trying to stage a coup. Marco, get her in the truck." I didn't argue. The terrifying reality of the situation left no room for my shattered pride. I grabbed my plastic medical basket, my hands shaking violently, and followed them out of the glass house into the freezing mountain air. The drive back down the mountain was a suffocating nightmare. The heavily armored SUV tore through the winding dirt roads, the silence in the back seat stretching between Charles and me like a physical wall. He sat beside me, his massive frame tense, his dark eyes fixed on the gray forest blurring past the tinted windows. He didn't try to touch me. He didn't try to explain. He was already at war. Hours later, the sprawling skyline of the city emerged from the fog. We didn't head for a hidden bunker or a secondary safe house. Marco drove the SUV straight toward the wealthiest, most heavily fortified district in the Narrows. "Boss," Marco warned from the driver's seat, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "Driving straight through the front gates is suicide. Reyes's men will be swarming the grounds." "Drive through the gates, Marco," Charles ordered, pulling a spare magazine from the center console and sliding it into his pistol with a sharp metallic click. "If I hide in the shadows now, the families will think I am weak." I walked through the front door of my own house. The SUV slowed as we approached a massive wrought iron gate set into towering stone walls. The gates were already wide open, The heavy security detail that usually patrolled the perimeter was completely gone. The eerie silence of the sprawling, manicured estate was far more terrifying than a hail of gunfire. Marco parked the truck right at the base of the sweeping marble steps leading up to the main mansion. "Stay behind me," Charles ordered, his gaze finally snapping to mine. The cold, ruthless exterior cracked for just a fraction of a second, revealing a desperate, burning need to keep me safe. "Do not leave my sight, Maya. Do you understand?" "I understand," I whispered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. We climbed the marble steps, Charles kicking the heavy double doors open. The grand foyer of the estate was breathtaking, a masterpiece of white marble, crystal chandeliers, and sweeping staircases. But it was entirely empty. There were no cartel soldiers, there were no dead bodies, it was completely silent. "Well," a smooth, dark voice echoed from the top of the marble staircase. "You always were incredibly hard to kill, Charles." I looked up, and the air completely left my lungs. Slowly descending the sweeping stairs was a woman who looked like absolute lethal perfection. And she wore a tailored crimson dress that contrasted violently with the white marble. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, and the cold, calculating amusement in her dark eyes was terrifying. She wasn't holding a weapon. She radiated a power that didn't need one. Charles raised his pistol, aiming it directly at the center of her chest. He didn't hesitate. "Where is Reyes, Jolene?" Jolene reached the bottom of the stairs, entirely unfazed by the gun pointed at her heart. She waved a perfectly manicured hand, dismissing the threat. "Oh, he left an hour ago. He only came to secure my guarantee, to make sure the transition of power would be seamless once the families found out you bled to death in an alleyway." She stopped a few feet away from us, her sharp gaze sweeping over Charles's pale face, taking in the slight stiffness of his posture. Then, her eyes slowly shifted. They bypassed the barrel of the gun, bypassed Marco, and locked directly onto me. The way she looked at me made my blood run absolutely cold. It was the look of a predator examining a very fragile piece of prey. She took in my oversized cheap clothes, my messy hair, and the way I was instinctively standing half hidden behind Charles's massive frame. A slow, chilling smile spread across Jolene's lips. She took a step closer to me, the scent of expensive, heavy perfume cutting through the cold air of the foyer. "So, this is the little doctor," Jolene murmured, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous, unspoken history. Charles shifted his weight, moving to block her line of sight, his voice dropping to a lethal growl. "Don't look at her. Don't speak to her." Jolene ignored him entirely. She tilted her head, locking eyes with me, delivering her words with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Maya," Jolene whispered, the cruel amusement dripping from every syllable. "He collects people who save his life." She stepped back, she smile widening into something truly monstrous as she delivered the final devastating blow. "I was one of them once,